PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. Sinquefield Cup, 8th and penultimate round. Alireza Firouzja leading the field by a clear point. But he faced a big test in round 8. Black against Nepomniachtchi. Now, Nepo, we know he's kind of a bit all over the place. On his day, when he's banging out the moves, he can just roll people over. But then again, he can make terrible slips and it can all go horribly wrong. You never know what you're going to get. So, what have we got in the opening? Well, it's a 4 knights, very steady from Nepo, and, well, not bishop b5, but d4. So now we've transposed into a pretty tame kind of scotch. It's well known that Black doesn't have too many difficulties in this line, but watch and see what happens. So threats already to take on e4, so White exchanges on c6, and that allows him to play bishop d3, covering that e-pawn. So d5. So this is an age-old variation and theoretically should be absolutely fine for Black. But it's a solid way for White to play, and there are some wrinkles you have to be careful of. So Nepo took on d5. Now you can just recapture, but castles is the trendy way for Black to play. You're inviting White to take on c6, but then after rook e8, Black gets quite a tasty initiative. So Nepo simply castled kingside. That's the prudent way to go. And c takes d5 would transpose into absolutely normal lines, and that should be okay for Black. But Firouzja plays bishop g4. So this is a little bit unusual, but it's certainly not bad for Black. So it's quite provocative. I mean, you're hoping that White is going to play f3, which just slightly weakens the king. And then, for example, like this, and a check. And that's fine for Black. This pawn is going to be recaptured. Black doesn't have too many difficulties there. So this causes White just a little bit of a problem because, you know, what do you do about the queen? Well, Nepo very quickly, typically, put the knight back on e2. C takes. And this just looks absolutely fine for Black. You know, if we compare with the standard line of c takes d5, and here, you know, White will go bishop g5 and queen f3. The queen stands quite well on f3. I mean, White has a tiny something. You know, it's a little bit more comfortable for White, although it should be fine for Black. But after this, in this position, you can see that the queen is simply restricted. It can't come to that nice square on f3. And the bishop has already developed very nicely. It can come back to g6, exchange off this nice bishop on d3. I mean, this looks like an improvement on normal lines, basically, for Black. So far, after the opening, Firouzja doing pretty well, I would say. You know, he's happy with the draw here. You know, he's just edging closer to first place as he's a point clear. c4. That gets taken. And this position has been seen in a few games. And clearly Firouzja has done his homework because only one player previously has played bishop d6. And that's the move that Firouzja goes with. And that's the computer-approved move. This was played in precisely 3 seconds. So, well, why bishop d6? Well, on b4 it's doing nothing. On d6 it's defended solidly. And it's pointing in the right direction at the king side. I mean, Black's position just looks solid here. You could argue that these pawns are split. White's pawns are slightly better. But when they're so well protected like this, it's not a big deal at all. It looks roughly level. Bishop e3 played. And now I really like this next move, rook e8. Lining up on the bishop. And after rook e1, Well, Firouzja thought for 8 minutes and played rook takes bishop. Now things start to hot up. So a pure exchange sacrifice. So what has black got for this? Well, that dark square bishop is key. So looking at these weakened squares here. Once the pawn has moved from f2, then g3 is weaker. This pawn is weak in itself. Black has very free development. You know, altogether it looks like decent compensation to me. So for example, okay, what if white defended this pawn with, say, queen b3? Well then, g5 is an extraordinary move, a very good move, preventing the knight coming to f4. And that means that black now threatens queen e5. And this could be really nasty. You know, if white is going to have to defend with a move like, well, you can't defend with a move like g3. It's just this knight gets eliminated. So this is already a really powerful threat, and it's clear that black has really good compensation. So Nepo thought for almost 3 minutes here. He's really slowing down, and played queen d4. So obviously preventing queen e5. An 18-minute thought for rook d8 from Firouzja, threatening a check on h2 and winning the queen. And if king h1, well, knight e4 and black's initiative is already really dangerous. With this knight looking at these squares here, you know, potential to take here. Or maybe a check here. There's going to be a discovered attack on the queen. It's really dangerous. So Nepo compromises. He plays knight f4. Bishop c5, and the queen is running short of good squares. I mean, the only square it can go to is c3. And bishop b4 wins back the exchange. I mean, can black get anything more than that? I think the problem is when you play knight e4, then this bishop is hanging. I mean, obviously the queen would have to move first, but yeah, afterwards it's a problem that the bishop is hanging. So Firouzja simply grabs the exchange back. So after that, you know, the position is certainly less dangerous for white once this dark square bishop is gone. Both sides have slightly compromised their pawn structure. So here, there's an isolated pawn. These are split. But all in all, it looks roughly level. The only thing is the position of the bishop is a little bit awkward on h5. But there are various ways around this. One could just play bishop g6 here. Now, that allows white to take that pawn. Careful, there's a pin. But actually, after this, black has enough play. You know, black is actually very solid here. The rook is strong on the second rank. It's hard for white to activate when the rook has to keep hold of the pawn. Enough compensation for the pawn. But Firouzja played queen e5. And queen b3. So there's pressure here. And then bishop g6. I mean, this is all just a little bit surprising. Firouzja gives a pawn in another way. So clearly he's thinking that after this is what happened. Then his king is tucked away and pretty safe. And all his pieces are good. I mean, it's similar to that other variation. Black certainly has compensation here. I think white's problem is it's difficult to control everything. You know, the second rank is weak. This pawn is weak. There's potential to hit this one. Black's pieces are active. It's hard to tie everything together. So, for example, if queen c4, with potential to check here, then queen g3. you can see that black's pieces are really strong. That's quite menacing, this kind of move coming. So Nepo compromises. After a 10-minute think, my goodness, he went into the tank. Queen c3. So an endgame would certainly be desirable for white. Rook and bishop can combine very well, and white has an extra pawn. So Firouzja keeps the queens on, and then goes knight d5. So Nepo thinks, again, a big think. 13 minutes he thought over this next move, and he decides to simplify, and he exchanges off the knight. It is a little bit scary, you know, you don't want to have this knight wandering around, and black is going to recapture a pawn, so Nepo just takes. But the problem is, yes, this holds on to the extra pawn, but heavy piece endgames are notoriously drawish. Particularly when white's king isn't altogether secure. I mean, secure enough, but it's hard for white to really activate when the king isn't well defended. Queen d6, so that takes control of the file, and the rook can enter on one of these squares. e4, yeah, rook d2, nice active pieces. a4, rook d3. You can see this is a weak pawn. This is a weak pawn. The king is also not so well defended. So, you know, when you have these loose elements in the position, it is very hard to hold everything together. So rook in an excellent position attacking those two. Therefore, Nepo decides to simplify. But once we get into the rook endgame, now it's even material, and this is drawn. So the game went like this. I'm just going to zip forward very quickly. I mean, that was actually precisely calculated, but you can see that it's, yeah, there's not a lot to play for now. Once the king is pegged back to defending this pawn, then, well, it's clear that white isn't going to get anywhere. And if I can zip through, I mean, this game was 80, but we're only on move 45. This game went to move 80. So let me just get to, I don't know, this position. Mate threatened, but after this one, this simplifies. And that's an important move, making sure that there are more pawn exchanges. And yeah, that was the end of that, basically. Draw. So Alireza Firouzja survives that test. I mean, not the most fascinating round 8, I have to say. In general, the games were they were all drawn. But I thought, you know, this one showed some spark at the beginning with this exchange sacrifice, and yeah, for a few moments it looked interesting before it fizzled again. But they had to play very precisely, I have to say. So, as all games were drawn, that meant that Alireza maintained his point lead, going into the final round. So Caruana is a point behind. So they're places 1 and 2. So, well, barring any disasters, then Firouzja should win the tournament, but we've still got a tricky last round to play. Tune in, I'll be reporting back on what happened.